All right, moving on to the third topic I wanted to quickly touch on. Not going to go in super in depth on this today. That is the Chicago Bears offseason. So I'll put up. So going over the list, I'll have a tweet on screen that shows sort of the list of the players that the Bears have added and lost. I don't want to go through reading every single one for you. That'll take us too long. But really so far through free agency, I know there are some Bears fans that are a bit disappointed, feel a little bit down on how things have transpired so far this offseason for the Bears. Some of it not even to their fault. That partially being because included in the changes for the Bears is a key veteran retiring. That being center Drew Dahlman, who announced, I believe it was right before free agency started. He announced that he had decided he's gonna retire from the NFL. So, he was a huge deal for the Bears in 2025. They had just traded for him last year. Traded with the Falcons to get him in, signed him to a 3-year deal, and Dahlman played every single game for the Bears, including in the playoffs. Played basically every offensive snap. I'm not even sure if he missed a single one. I know he played and started every single game for the Bears. And obviously that was a huge deal for Caleb Williams. Experienced, very talented. I think 14-year NFL veteran center who could help take care of making sure the line was good, making sure that they knew what they were doing. Having a veteran center that knows what they're doing, that's a huge deal for quarterbacks. I mean, offensive lines in general, very underrated in football, and in the NFL, offensive lines don't get enough credit, but centers for sure. And I think the offensive lines have been getting a little bit more credit and recognition in recent years, thanks to personalities like Jason Kelsey, names like that, who was a center, Hall of Fame level center that, people know who he is. Some of that I feel like has helped a little bit, but still, I don't think most fans understand how important an offensive line really is. Football really is won and lost in the trenches for offense and defense, and especially on offense. If you're a quarterback, especially if you got a young quarterback, quarterbacks have so much that they have to deal with, both physically and mentally, that they have to do in order to play good, and be the on-field general. And so especially for a young quarterback that's in the NFL, and the NFL game is just a totally different speed than college and high school. And it's also, there's a lot more that's asked of quarterbacks generally once they get into the NFL, and players in general. There's a lot that gets asked of them at that point. But, the amount of things that quarterbacks have to handle mentally, as far as the play calls, that kind of thing, there's so much that, yes, for a veteran quarterback that has all that down pat, they've got the speed of the game, they're used to all that. For a veteran quarterback, they don't necessarily need that help as much, but of course, even then, an offensive line overall is still very important. But for a young quarterback, who maybe just struggling enough just to remember play calls and understand that kind of stuff, it can be helpful for younger quarterbacks to have a center who can be sort of the general in command on the field for the rest of the offensive line to take some stuff off the quarterback's plate that they would otherwise have to deal with. So losing Drew Dahlman, to him retiring this offseason, that's a huge hole that the Bears now have. So that is just right there off the bat. That's a tough one. And the Bears haven't yet really done. Now the Bears did bring in Garrett Bradbury at center, so that's likely going to be the response there. They did bring him in in free agency. Not a huge money deal, not a huge long-term contract, so I don't necessarily expect him to be a Drew Dalman replacement. But to be fair, with all of the Bears' free agency moves and where they're at roster-wise and cap-wise, is the Bears didn't come into this offseason with the most cap space. So part of that, they did lose some other players that I know a lot of Bears fans, including myself, a little bit disappointed that we had to see him go. And that includes on defense, Kevin Byard and Nahshon Wright, two guys that contributed to the Bears defense being top of the league in takeaways and interceptions. I mean, Kevin Byard alone had 7 interceptions. So the Bears lose him. He ended up signing with the Bills. Of course, the Bears traded DJ Moore to the Bills. Lost Tremaine Edmonds at linebacker, lost a few other players, but also added some as well that, some underrated ones. Kobe Bryant was a good one. There's certainly some free agents in the list for the Bears that I'm very interested to see how they do. But the thing is I think for the most part, for the Bears, I'm really just interested to see what they do with the draft. Because again, they did end up signing a center. So that'll likely be their response there. At first when it was announced that Drew Dalman was planning to retire, I thought, oh, well, maybe the Bears are going to pivot in the draft. Maybe they go for center with the first overall pick now, because this is supposed to be, as far as I understand, a pretty good draft for centers, some offensive line positions, and then as well for defensive line. Pretty good draft there. So, which with Drew Dalman retiring and with the other Bears needs, those fit the Bears needs. So this should be a good draft for the Bears. But again, they do bring in Garrett Bradbury at center. So I'm guessing that is going to possibly be, a little bit of a filling in of the gap there. Who knows? Maybe they still draft a center at some point in the draft. I certainly wouldn't expect that'll be the first round now. My assumption now for the Bears' early draft goes back to what it was before, which was I do very much expect the Bears to focus very heavily, at least in the first few rounds of the draft, on defense, and mainly on defensive line, defensive edge. The Bears did bring in a couple defensive tackles in free agency. They brought in Neville Gallimore and then Kentavious Street. So a couple defensive tackles they brought in there. Again, brought in a couple secondary players, brought in Khalif Raymond at wide receiver to help fill in the gap for losing DJ Moore and Olamide Zaccheaus at wide receiver. So I wouldn't say that like there's a, big signing for the Bears. But I'm not going to over panic about that. Sometimes I think with free agency, it can be a little bit of fool's gold for fans. Sometimes with these players, no discredit or disrespect to any NFL player that gets to free agency, but for free agency, the rule of free agency is that if a player gets to there and you're wanting them, especially if you're signing them early in free agency, you're likely overpaying for whatever it is you're going to end up getting. If a player got to free agency, chances are whatever their asking price, whatever their and their agent's asking price is for their talents, if their previous team wasn't willing to sign them or able to, it's possible that even if maybe your team has more cap space and more need there, so you're able to make it work, chances are you're overpaying for what you're going to get in return. So a lot of times with free agency, we get these big signings, we get these big trades, and a lot of times the teams that, a lot of times when looking back on the big splash free agency moves, a lot of times they don't end up panning out as much as fans would think. So, it's easy to look at free agent moves that are smaller or names that maybe don't, make headlines as much and go, that's boring. But oftentimes, a lot of times, those are the free agent moves that end up being huge and, end up surprising you once football actually starts. And you go, oh, who was this guy? Oh, we added him in free agency? I totally forgot. So again, for the Bears, didn't have a ton of cap space to work with necessarily. So that's part of it. But I don't necessarily think the moves that the Bears have made were bad at all. And honestly, for Ryan Poles and Ben Johnson as well, of course, but Ryan Poles is the Bears general manager. I trust in him. Obviously, I very much trust in Ben Johnson and Caleb Williams on offense and for the team on the field. But Ryan Poles, I think, gets maybe not enough credit as the Bears general manager. I mean, there's a reason he's stayed as the Bears general manager as long as he has so far. I think he's earned that, and I do think he deserves a little bit more trust and faith from the fan base and from NFL fans in general on what he's doing. We've got other GMs in the league that that are very much respected, that have made a name for themselves, obviously through getting their teams to Super Bowls and that kind of stuff. Now, sure, Ryan Poles hasn't done that yet. And I'm not saying Ryan Poles is perfect. He's had some bad drafts, especially the first couple drafts. There were some picks that were pretty bad. Especially at wide receiver, there were some misses there. But, the biggest one, of course, for Ryan Poles, if you want to argue for Ryan Poles as a good GM, is just look at the Bryce Young trade. Not that the Panthers lost that trade necessarily, but all those draft picks that the Bears ended up getting, plus the trade for DJ Moore, yes, the Bears have now traded him away and got another draft pick. So really the Panthers-Bears trade, that one comes up quite often this last few years. But it ended up giving the Bears the first round pick the next year, which they used on Caleb Williams. It gave them a couple other, 2 or 3 other picks that they've since used that have gone to Luther Burden, who's come onto the scene and been a really good wide receiver for the Bears. Part of the reason they were able to go ahead and trade DJ Moore is because they feel like they've got a wealth of riches at wide receiver now. They were able to get a couple other key players, some on defense. I'm forgetting which players are all exactly on that specific draft outside of Luther Burden and Caleb Williams. So I don't want to say the wrong names on which ones, but if you look at that draft and the exact names that the Bears have gotten just for trading away a pick that became Bryce Young, I would say that Ryan Poles deserves a ton of credit for getting all that back for that pick. And then they've also made some other pretty good picks. They brought in some pretty good players in here. Again, this Bears team, 2025 was one of the best seasons that the Bears have had in my lifetime, 27 years. So, a lot of that credit this year goes to Ben Johnson and stuff, but Ryan Poles has been the one, that put together a lot of that roster even before Ben Johnson got there. So, the Bears have a lot of work to do, mainly on defense. It was bottom of the league in almost every category. Not bottom of the league, but like bottom 5, bottom 10 in most categories outside of takeaways. They were first in takeaways and interceptions in 2025, but almost every other defensive category, the Bears were near the bottom of the barrel. So that is the obvious need for the Bears. And again, it's mainly needs that they have at defensive edge, and then maybe some extra help in in the secondary. Again, some of that they addressed through free agency, but for the most part, I would like to see the Bears, and I do expect them to put a lot of investment in the 2026 draft here, just about a month into the defense. So, if the Bears defense can just be average at most categories and the offense can be as good as it was in 2025, especially late in games, the Bears are going to still be good. Are they going to be as good or better? I don't know, but I do expect that they'll be in competition for the playoffs, which is saying something in an NFC North that is pretty competitive and has been in the last few years.